It's a really good movie. Um, what did you think of it?
Yes, it's not, pardon me, I've aged. Uh, yeah, I don't, I still can't see it objectively as a movie. It's, that's me and him and
It doesn't feel like a character you made up?
well, he seems like quite distant, very far from anything that I think of as me. And the whole thing is so. I still work with him, and so the conversation continues, but it is so. The movie is fantastical to me because, we made it at a very particular moment, and if it had been a year later, we wouldn't have made that same movie. And if he and I talk today, it's not like that. I mean, of course, this is a made-up conversation. But yeah, for me, it's. I mean, now we're both. For example, what struck me in the last part of the film, we're talking about death. Oh, so much talking about death. Now we're quite close to death. I'm 80. He's 90. I don't think about it very much, and it doesn't seem that important.
I have so many questions. I mean, maybe the first one, which is maybe the most obvious, if you can also just say pass to any of my questions, because I always wish I could do that in Q&As, so I wanted to invite you to do that if you want to. Would you be willing to give us a little context for the year when you did decide to write this script together, and where you were at in your collaboration as theater artists? What made you decide to write this script? What you can remember about the conversation that led you to wanting to make a movie about yourselves as characters having a conversation on film.
Well, we had done a play a play that I'd written, that André directed, and then he left the company. He had a permanent company and of actors. Such things were maybe easier to do then. There was even briefly a period of enthusiastic government subsidy for avant-garde theater. Then things changed, obviously, but they did a play of mine, and that helped destroy the company. But also, André wanted to leave theater and do some of the things described in the movie. And so I didn't see much of him, as I said in the movie. The movie, the dinner didn't ever happen, so that's fiction. But most of the things that we talk about, including some of his strange stories, that was all real. So he went away, and then he came back, and he mostly was living at home during that period that he describes. These were brief trips that he was taking. But he was definitely out of the theater, and he came back and said, well, let's do another play. And the experience of doing the first play was very hard. It took 3 years or something. And I thought, well, what really interests you is what you've just been through. And I think it would be quite funny to do maybe a TV movie or something like that, where there'd be you and you'd talk about what you did, and I would react as I do. And it would be funny. And that was the germ of it. And of course, and then we met over several months and talked into an audio tape recorder with no structure or no, we just, would talk for 3 or 4 hours.
Like in your apartments or in restaurants?
Yes, in apartments. We didn't, there was no idea of there being a dinner or a restaurant. We didn't know any of that, but we talked, and again, this is a strange thing, but there was someone at public TV, Sue Weil, who said, well, we'll give you the money to transcribe these conversations. And so they did that and gave me a big pile of papers. And I tried to make some kind of a sense out of them or a story out of them or whatever. And this was in the late 70s. And as far as speaking of the time, 1980, December was when we made the movie. And in November, Ronald Reagan elected, 1980. And then in December, that was the murder of John Lennon. And so by the time the movie was made, we were living in a different world. We never would have made this movie.
It's very clear to me that it's a movie and should have always been a movie, but I get into these weird conversations with people where they ask me why things are movies and why things are plays. And I was wondering, to me, so much of it is about, this is like the great close-up movie. And his work on your faces is so extraordinary, Louis Malle. Were you clear from the beginning that it was going to be a movie and not a play?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
In other words, have people in Europe have done it as a play, and I've seen it a couple of times. But it's very, very, very static.
Yeah.
And we did it at upstairs at the Royal Court for I think 3 weeks.
You and Wally?
André and I did
you and
this
André?
as a play. Louis Malle wanted us to do it as a play for, I think, 60 people, an audience of 60, and to give us a better sense of the shape of it. What was the climax of it? What was the shape? Even though we'd already memorized the whole text, and we'd rehearsed it for months, he wanted us to do it for an audience. And so we did it as a play, but we were sitting, inches away from everybody. So it was okay. It wasn't so bad. But Louis Malle he didn't think, particularly he was critical of me, that because there was an audience, I showed off. And
you were hamming it up?
Yeah.
I'm so curious about what it was like working with him when you were shooting the movie on playing a version of yourself, and what kind of notes he gave you, if you remember.
Well, he was not interested in what we were really like. And, he, and neither was I, because in writing the script, I made us into characters, and I was trying to get rid of the character that I played. That was my goal. And André was no longer doing any of these strange things, so that we were acting, But in my case, for instance, I, in real life, would have been much more polite than I was in the movie, even though looking at it now, I think I'm being pretty polite right there. But in real life, I would have not been so open in revealing the negative things that I felt. But Louis would press me to do that, and if I ever said, but I would never do that, he didn't care. He was thinking of it as a character. And, I said, but I don't want to drink red wine. I would never do that. And he said, well, your character drinks red wine. That's it.
Wait, what would you have drunk?
I would have drunk a glass of, soda water.
It's so interesting watching. I've seen this movie so many times, never on the big screen, and there's some you're playing these archetypes, the two of you, of the seeker and the doubter, who then finds some sort of like tender common ground at the very end. And it's so interesting to watch this movie at different times in my life, because in so many different relationships I have with different people I play, you're either André or you're Wally in different moments in your life with different people. And it's interesting to me that he pushed you to sort of like, to almost lean into the archetypes.
Yes.
Yeah. And how do you feel about that now, watching it? Like, are you glad that he pushed you to...
Oh, I think it's very gently done. I mean, he was a wonderful director of actors, and I'm surprisingly. I mean, it does seem, the whole thing is so, because of the world that we live in. It seems like a crazy conversation that you could never have now. But I'm not embarrassed about the acting. And, he pushed André to talk at hysterical speed. That's not what he ever was. So that he seems at moments deranged, but that's the movie.
Can you talk a little about the waiter, who is the most extraordinary person and presence, and if you knew he would be important, and how you found the actor?
I originally thought that maybe we would be walking down the street in New York having this conversation. It wasn't about being in a restaurant. And I thought we would pass people who were working, like digging a ditch. Because to me, it's a portrait of privileged people having a privileged conversation, obviously. And I thought we should see some actual people who were in the real world working. And then when it became a dinner, then, the description in the script is that the waiter it looks sort of like Arnold Schoenberg, and is obviously smarter than the people at the table. And we asked, André was a very close friend of Richard Avedon, who knew a lot of faces, and we asked Avedon, who do you know anybody with the right face? And he thought about it, and he said, well, I do. He's a former film editor, Jean Lenauer, a French film editor, and let's look him up. Now, you may not know what I'm about to refer. You know what a phone book? The phone book used to exist, and he looked up to see if Jean Lenauer was still alive and whether he was in the New York phone book, and he was. We called him up.
And did he audition?
No, he just he took
He
the part.
took the part. He's so extraordinary, and it's that I was so moved by. I mean, I've always been moved by that last speech that André makes about the son turning into the boy, turning into the man who picks you up, and then it cuts to the waiter, and it feels like that's some extension of the man and the man's life that he was just speaking of. It's so beautiful, and that's so interesting. So I think this is one of the most entertaining movies I've ever seen, but I'm curious if at any point people told you it was boring, or that it would be boring, or that if you were worried about it being boring, and if so, what you did about that fear or how you dealt with it.
I have no reason to conceal myself. I have a lot of, I never thought it would be boring. The original script, though, was longer. This was an hour and 47, and the original script would have been 3 hours. And it didn't occur to me that it would be boring. But Louis was concerned, I guess, so we spent an incredible amount of time, an enraging amount of time to him, with the three of us, André and Louis and myself, sitting at a table cutting the script. And Louis would suggest things to cut, and I would, every single time, resist and explain why there shouldn't be a cut. And I think this was the unbearable part of the process for Louis, and he definitely did not want to work with me again because of that, I think. And although he was fond of me, but as far as writing went, he wanted to work with John Guare, who was more understanding of how you make films. He liked me when I was an actor much more. I've met many people who more have said, "Oh, I loved your film. My husband was bored." A couple of people have said to me, "Well, I just couldn't cope with it, But I'm sure many people who I haven't met were bored. I don't know.
I'm really glad. I'm really heartened that you weren't worried about it. And were you in the edit at all, or did he edit it without you guys?
I visited the editing room quite a bit, but I had no role in it. I mean, in other words, it was, most of the cutting had been done around that table. There was a little cutting that they did in the editing room, and he worked with his French editor, and it took a very long time, an unbelievably long time.
Do you remember how long?
I think it took most of a year to edit it, and it had, I think the typical film is that there's 1 foot of film used for every 10 feet that are filmed. I mean, if you're using film. And that was pretty much the same with us. It was very, very, very careful. Well, obviously, carefully edited.
Okay, well, I scrawled down all these things very fervently while I was watching it this time. I'm going to see if there's anything. I wrote down the theme is oneself. Well, I was thinking about the idea of the beehive, like Grotowski's beehive. The theme is oneself. The evening was made up of a shifting, a kaleidoscope. What is it about? Wally's listening. Okay, I'm going to stop reading my notes. I think maybe what I'm trying to ask is because you're still writing plays and you're still writing beautiful plays. I'm curious if some of the questions Wally, the character as playwright, raises in this movie about reality and theater, or if actually like the structure of this sort of like odd kaleidoscopic conversational structure of this movie itself still feels relevant to the kind of work you're trying to do as a playwright and also essayist. You're a beautiful essayist, the kind of work you're doing now at 80. Like, what are your concerns?
Well, I mean, I was trying in writing this to escape a kind of complacency that I felt creeping up in myself. A person close to me said, who was critical of the movie said, well, this is a defense of mediocrity. And I was, I did change, but not in a direction that I expected. I mean, Reagan was elected, and even the dumbest person almost would have had to recognize that there are a lot of hints in the film of a political interest, not on my side, but things that André says. And everything that he says is based on stuff that he really said in our conversations on tape, except that the beginning of the sentence he might have said in February and the end of the sentence in April. But, I didn't go to the Sahara or eat sand, but my complacency was killed by becoming, let's say, aware of my own role in the world, and coming to understand that as a taxpayer and citizen of the United States, I was let's say, I'd formerly had a kind of complacent view of that, and I came to sort of see that the United States could be seen as a very dangerous force in the world, or you could say an enemy of humanity, or whatever you want to say. But that's still. So, and André, interestingly, we've tracked politically. he was always quite on the left in a way, and the character, my girlfriend Debbie, I mean, for those who follow such things, I mean, Deborah Eisenberg,
Still your girlfriend?
Still my girlfriend Debbie, fiction, a great fiction writer, always was left wing. I was a centrist, you know, someone who saw himself more as an observer of the world rather than a participant, as a privileged American. Of course, I have a huge role on planet Earth. And so André and I have amazingly tracked together. We both, are, card-carrying leftists, really. And I became, as emotional as he becomes about the handprints. I became politically, which I think a lot of centrists kind of would have in the Reagan era, and I became less fearful, which is something I sort of aspired to in working on this movie. And my girlfriend Debbie and I traveled to some scary places in Central America while these things, terrible things were happening there, and did things that were slightly scary, whereas this character in the movie wouldn't have done those things, kind of. So, I mean, I'm still a fearful person. I'm still very bourgeois, and definitely, a bourgeois person and a privileged person. Not because I came from a privileged background, but then I was successful as a humorous actor and paid for that. I mean, I was paid money to be funny and whatever that word means, and so became privileged. I had a period of being downward mobile, but then, privilege has its magical powers that I don't exactly know why being privileged as a child made me more successful as an actor, but I think it did.
It's interesting, thinking about your childhood, and I was just told we only have a couple minutes left, but one of my favorite things about this movie is the fact that you mention your childhood at the very beginning, and then you mention it at the very end, and it's kind of, neither of your childhoods are present really, I mean, obviously unconsciously, but they're not mentioned explicitly in this like epic conversation, which I feel like if you made this movie now, everybody would be talking about their childhood the whole dinner. But you evoke it so poetically and so beautifully at the beginning and the end, and it kind of, especially at the end in the taxi cab where you talk about the memories of your father and of growing up in New York, in the taxi cab, it just sort of, I always feel something open up, and I'm not sure exactly what it is. And I was wondering if that was always there, if you always knew you would be talking about your childhood at the very beginning and the very end of this movie.
No. I just, I didn't know that.
When did that happen?
Well, it turned into the dinner, and probably quite late in writing the script. I mean, the script took a couple of years, even though it's made up of, basically scraps of reality, of the real conversations, but maybe with a little bit of filling in. But I mean, and to go back to your question about boringness, of course, I knew it had to have a story, a beginning, a middle, and an end. And I agree with you about the plot, that he wins me over. You know, that's the plot. And so I think the idea of bringing in childhood came very late. But it does seem, it seems, you know, right for it.
Thank you. Thank you for this movie. Thank you, everybody, for being here.